Good afternoon, everyone. Today I have for you a book on a topic that I don't wander into too much because I deal with it too much during the daytime. Not this topic specifically, but the hard sciences. The book is Finding Darwin's God, a scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution by Kenneth R. Miller. Kenneth Miller is a professor of biology at Brown University and has made a bit of a name of himself, for himself in communities that are really concerned with the intersection between science and faith, or science and religion, both on the atheist skeptical side and on the religious and sometimes creationist side. But he successfully manages to irritate both camps because he says something which I don't think is too controversial. I think there are plenty of scientists who would say the same thing. That is, he's a fervent believer in evolution, but he's also a deist. He believes in a God. He happens to be a Catholic. So he thinks that evolution and belief in God are not contradictory, as they are so often portrayed to be in the popular media and the popular press. I don't think this opinion should be too controversial a statement for someone who's thought about the issue for more than a few minutes, but it still seems to disconcert and confuse people. This book works in some ways, but isn't quite advertised to be what it is. And that's the reason why I gave this book, you can tell in the drop-down box, 3 out of 5 stars. The first part of it, which I'm about to describe, is quite well done, and then the second part kind of falls apart argumentatively. Judging from the title alone, you might guess it involves a lot of digging through Darwin's papers for his religious or non-religious, as the case may be, inclinations, and to be fair, we do get a very small amount of this. It'll probably come as no surprise that Darwin was sometimes less conflicted concerning the evidence for a Christian God, and sometimes more conflicted. The same case goes with deism. Earlier in his career, he was very convinced by the arguments of renowned 18th century English scientist and paleontologist William Paley, whose watchmaker analogy you're probably familiar with. He talks about the watchmaker analogy in his book Natural Theology. But Darwin seemed to become markedly more skeptical as his life went on, especially as the publication date for The Origin of Species approached, and was almost certainly an avowed agnostic by the time he died. But of course, all of this is, I think you can probably quote mine all you want to shore up either opinion, but it's tough to say that he didn't get more skeptical as his life went on. When he died, who knows what he believed? No one was in the room, but that certainly seems to be the way that even Kenneth Miller, who's a believing Catholic himself, portrays Darwin. First, the part of the book that I wasn't expecting, but was actually the best part. And that's approximately the first 2/3 of the book, that is dedicated to demolishing creationist science, which actually, of course, really isn't science at all, and particularly young Earth creationism, which, anyone who's taken 8th grade science can really demolish on their own, but he is really, really good at it. So, in case you ever find yourself debating a young Earth creationist, this is the go-to book. I realized the continuing need for popular science education, but I was more interested in the Finding Darwin's God angle than in a rehashing of basic high school biology and chemistry, which we were all supposed to have learned. Even though this part of the book was a bit of a slog, he was really thorough and brought some really interesting, not very often brought up arguments up, and they're obviously really well integrated into the argument and support evolution fully when you see how he talks about them. He shows how a literal interpretation of Genesis no longer makes any sense, considering what we know about broad topics like morphology, radioactive dating, the fossil record, etc. He also equips someone who might be less familiar with pro-evolutionary arguments with examples, including the biochemical details of the blood clotting cascade and the development of the eukaryotic coelom. There's a wonderful part of the book that explains how Gould's, that is Stephen Jay Gould, the former American evolutionary biologist, how Gould's punctuated equilibrium only exists as a different-looking phenomenon when you use shortened geological timescales, and that when you re-elongate these geological timescales, that punctuated equilibrium looks like the tree of descent that Darwin would have recognized himself. These couple of hundred pages were, the first two-thirds of the book, were largely designed to arm the non-biologist, who is nevertheless interested in evolution, with the technical arguments to combat creationist nonsense. And he does a really fine job in this part of the book. The last two chapters is where Miller finally gets to the Finding Darwin's God part, and gets to explore the possible arguments for God, or the kind of God that Darwin believed in, or that Miller thinks Darwin believed in. None of his arguments, for me, were very convincing, though. He even says a couple of things that are kind of embarrassing for a scientist of his caliber. Like when he wanders into the field of cosmology. He says this, quote, "When one makes a run backwards in time to the moment before the Big Bang, one must imagine inconceivable amounts of mass and energy concentrated at a single point in space." That's on page 225. End quote. Except that even talking about before the Big Bang makes no sense, since that very event is what created space and time as we know it. There was no time before the Big Bang that we know of. It's like talking about cakes before the time of baking. It seems that he might be trying to raise the question of what allowed the Big Bang to occur. It's a great question, and we have the greatest minds in science working on it, but the current answer is we don't know, so we kind of have to leave it there. A bit later, Miller delves into the miraculous, and he says this on page 239, quote, "What can science say about a miracle? Nothing. By definition, the miraculous is beyond explanation, beyond our understanding, beyond science. This does not mean that miracles do not occur. A key doctrine in my own faith," remember, he's a Catholic, "is that Jesus was born of a virgin, even though it makes no scientific sense. There is the matter of Jesus' Y chromosome to account for, but that is the point. Miracles, by definition, do not have to make any sense." End quote. This truly, I thought, was a disappointing argument for someone who just spent 200 pages, the majority of his book by far, arguing against creationism because it doesn't make any scientific sense. And then here he is asserting something that doesn't make any scientific sense. A little contradictory, I think. Confusing, to say the least. One of the points of science is to try to build heuristic models that explain the universe around us, or some aspect of that universe that accounts for the most observable data that we have. That's what science is all about. We must either reject or be agnostic about those phenomena which can't be assimilated into these models. And I think the virgin birth would probably be one of those phenomena. Miller sometimes waxes philosophical with about as much success and about as much accuracy too. On God's eternality, he has this to say on page 242. This means that God, who always has been and always will be, transcends time and therefore is the master of it. I realize that this is a stock and trade argument from classical Christian theology, but it is fundamentally flawed. Something cannot exist outside of time because time is a predicate of existence. To exist means to have come into existence at some particular time, and therefore must be within a temporal continuum. The popular formulation of this argument is when a theist asks an atheist what caused the Big Bang, and the atheist responds, what caused God? If you're operating under the assumption that everything needs a cause, as classical Christian theology often does, saying that God is an exception to your own rule isn't going to work. In fact, it's a logical fallacy known as special pleading. So why does Kenneth Miller believe in God? One reason seems to be his acceptance of the God of the gaps arguments. He seems to be kind of perplexed by the fact that we don't have all of cosmology explained away. The second is his peculiar interpretation of quantum mechanics, to say the least. He thinks that the random events of quantum mechanics and the simultaneous orderliness of the universe have something to do with a God, though he never really comes out and explicitly states it, and never clarifies how the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics could provide evidence for a God. But he seems to insinuate something like, on the quantum level we have pure randomness and indeterminacy. On the macrological level of the universe, we obviously have these Newtonian laws, gravity, that you can apply kinematics equations to, and you obviously see perfectly linear, continuous behavior. And how can you have one at one level and the other at the other level, and therefore God? I mean, that's kind of what he's going for, even though he doesn't quite come out and say it. The insinuation is clearly there. So what kind of God does Miller believe in? In the closing lines of the book, he quotes Darwin. Quote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most wonderful and most beautiful, have been and are being evolved." End quote. This is awe-filled Darwin. Darwin full of awe, at his most wondrous. However, even when Darwin indulged these sentiments, this is clearly the God of deism. A world set into motion by a distant, non-personal God who created natural laws and then let happen what may. It doesn't at all comport with the fundamental tenets of the Catholic Church, like the virgin birth or the Assumption, and many others, in which Miller claims to believe. Darwin's God wasn't the God of miracles, and therefore isn't Miller's God. He was the God of reverence for the mysteries of the universe, which have been slowly decreasing in number since the rise of modern science. This number will never reach zero. There will always be something new to learn, and science will never disappear. But looking for God in the unexplained nooks and crannies of science leaves a smaller and smaller place for him, her, or it with each passing year, and this seems to be a theological approach in danger of having God slip through its very fingers. Finding Darwin's God, the scientist's search for common ground between God and evolution, by Kenneth R. Miller.